Your chapter also discussed modernist architecture, and I've always been a big fan about talking about modernist architecture because it goes to this idea of form following function. That is like the quote for modernist architecture, that the form should follow the function. Now, you might be thinking, well, didn't buildings always do this? Well, maybe not really, because if you look back at other architecture before this, often they're very decorative pieces of architecture, or they're about like ornamentation, not maybe about like what is about proper function. Go back and look at, for instance, the Palace of Versailles. I'd argue Versailles is more about showing off, than functionality. So again, I think architecture in the past had different reasons for existing. When you get to modernist architecture of the 20th century, architects are thinking about like how can you make these things work as best as possible. The buildings, right? How do you make them work as best as possible? The Bauhaus is very well known within not just modernist architecture, but modernism in general. So it actually was a school in Germany, and they were very interested in just design on all levels. So if you're interested in design, definitely look into the Bauhaus in Walter Gropius. They did everything from posters and furniture to buildings and etc. And if you're looking at the building here, one of the things you'll notice is it's really about, again, the function of the building. And the couple things here, that speak to the rationality of it. You see a lot of more use of glass in modernist architecture. We call it the glass curtain wall. You see that in the picture. Again, go back to the architecture chapter. It hits upon a lot of these issues as well. And because the buildings can be, if you think about it, the buildings don't have a regional or like an ethnic look to them in any kind of way, we started to refer to this type of architecture as international style. This also applied to skyscrapers. So if you look at a skyscraper, again, go back to the architecture chapter and look at the pieces by Mies van der Rohe, etc. When you look at those pieces, again, you could plop them down in New York City or Beijing or Sao Paulo, anywhere in the world, and they're going to look like they belong. So that's why we call it international style. It's not about a regionality or an ethnicity. It's just this stuff works wherever you put it. And another quote here, that these are buildings that they radiate, logic. They don't try to trick you or fool you. So modernism is really about how do you make, as Le Corbusier says here, a machine for living. So Le Corbusier, he's known for residential architecture, and also if you're interested in utopianism, he's well known for planning these utopian communities that, of course, never got planned. It's utopianism, right? Or never got built. It's utopianism, but he's full of these interesting ideas about how do you make communities for living, right? And how do they function? This is his Villa Savoy that was built as a house or a private resident. And one of the things with the Villa Savoy we talk about is, again, how each space has a clear reason for existing, but at the same time, a lot of these spaces are about dual functionality. Notice there's a lot of indoor to outdoor space that flows one to the other, right? It kind of flows. It can be opened up. It can be closed off. This idea of having multiple purposes that could happen in a space. This is also a very Asian philosophy. So he was influenced by a lot of Asian thinking on this. If you've been to a Japanese restaurant, let's say, and you've seen them use those fusama walls that are made out of rice paper. So this idea of like opening spaces, closing spaces, having more function than one function. How can you live in this space the most practical way possible? Notice that these are not cluttered spaces. If you want to be a modernist, it's really about paring things down. It's about simplicity, not cluttering things up, right? So I would say, you want to be a modernist if you're able to have clean surfaces. If you can't do that, you're not a modernist, right? Another building that's talked about in this chapter is Frank Lloyd Wright's Guggenheim Museum. I'm showing you one Frank Lloyd Wright building. If you like architecture, definitely look into this man. He is an American treasure who is known for all kinds of great examples of modernist architecture, like this avant-garde piece, but also a lot of pieces that were about like how do you put architecture into the environment. Things like falling water, for instance. Amazing. The Guggenheim Museum in New York City He tried to create a very avant-garde, innovative structure where you have this wrapping, swirling, right, tower structure. Here are some photographs looking down into the structure. It's probably one of the most striking museums out there. And it causes some interesting conversations about how do you display your pieces here too, if you think about it, right? But again, a very innovative structure as well. Final thing in this chapter that's discussed is abstract expressionism. Can't stress enough that abstract expressionism, most art historians really feel like this is when American art took prominence in art history. This is about 1950. And we all sort of feel that, after this point, Europe really does not become the place where you go to look for great art. America is. So New York City, America, it starts to come up with the rise of this movement. And this movement is very theoretical. Basically, what you should really understand is that, the materials are primary, and the idea behind it is that the art should be what the medium allows. Now, what does that mean? A painting should only be what a painting allows, right? So what do you need for a painting? You need paint, you need some way to apply the paint, and you need somewhere for the paint to go. Notice that I didn't really say you need subject matter, right? So you can look at someone like Jackson Pollock, probably the best known abstract expressionist, and he creates what we call these drip paintings. And he speaks to this idea of feeling rather than illustrating. Go back and think about Picasso, what he said there. And this idea of like the painting not really being about subject, but process. So I always stress the process for my students, that if you look at these paintings, they're really about process. They're gigantic pieces. They really are about this continuous web of color and flow, but again, not about subject. He usually numbers them. He will again, not try to be descriptive. Lavender Mist was like a nickname the painting was given. I don't really think he'd like it too much. But notice we like subject, right? We like meaning. But again, when people ask me about these paintings, I'm like, it's about the process of the dripping and the throwing of the paint and the avant-gardeness of those actions. You also can look at someone like Mark Rothko, and he gets into this as well, but he takes a different approach, which we call color field. So it's not the dripping and the throwing, it's these kind of fields of color. And most of his works are called untitled. So again, you're not really going to get much direction from him about subject. But a lot of times people will say to me, does any of this stuff have meaning? And I'm like, well, look at what the artists say about it. This is Rothko talking about his own work. And you may not feel this way about the paintings, but notice that this is how he felt. And so he obviously had a strong emotional connection to what he was doing. Because a lot of people say, oh, my kid could do these paintings, or these paintings have no purpose or subject, and so they mean nothing. And I'm like, okay, you don't have to like them. I'm not saying you have to like them, but there is a reason behind them, and there often is a great emotional connection the artist felt as they pursued the subject as well. So it is important to keep in mind. One of the things I always talk about with my students is there's a difference between artist's purpose and viewer reaction. And again, a lot of art history and art appreciation is about understanding what you're looking at, but then understanding how you personally react to the material too.